start with our review for this book, The Element of Style. I'm gonna give it. It's kind of a little torn in around about this book. In one way, it's a 3, and I'll give it a 3. It might be even lower because of the fact that I read or listened to it on another book, and this is not the best way to go about reading this book because it's more about comparing sentences and differences, minor differences that it's sometimes hard to comprehend over audio, especially if you're not listening to it on a regular speed. So definitely some of the things here are better looking at. So that's why I'm gonna give this book 3. Even tempted to give this a 2, but I'm not gonna give this a 2 because of that. But it's not quite a 4. So there's some good ideas about writing. Definitely a lot of tips about writing better, but I felt one of the part that really bothered me here was this kind of felt a little outdated, and also how rigid his tips or rules, they call them rules, are. So it is a little old. So let's see the notes. Omit needless words, he said that quite a few times. Omit needless words. You need to just get it out. Between conjunctions, use comma, but not the last one before the end. So you use comma between conjunctions, and you don't use the last comma, even though there is some other people that say that you should use the last comma. So some differences. Completing sentences should not be separated with a comma, rather with a semicolon. If it's completing the sentence, it's better to separate them with a semicolon. In most cases, one sentence should not be a paragraph by itself. The question is like, what should consist of paragraph? But usually if it's just one sentence, most cases again, it should not be a paragraph by itself. The active voice is always preferred. It's like ing, it's like active, present voice. Using positive instead of negative is preferred, instead of not. For example, use the opposite, like positives instead of not, or negative, not in the literal sense of negative, just like the not things. Hope that makes sense. Side note, the audio version of the book is not the best way to go about reading it due to the sentence differences. That's what I spoke about in the review part. It's better to see. Some things are better seeing with your eyes. Use auxiliaries such as could and would only when uncertainty is present. So that's when you use would instead of will, is when there is uncertainty. Try to be as clear as possible in your language. It's very important to be clear and concise. Omit the phrase the fact. He says that it's needless. You don't need that. It's redundant. Instead of X who is a member, write X is a member. You don't need to write the who. We just write X is a member. You don't write X who is a member. Even though sometimes I feel like it adds more who is a member instead of X is a member. It's kind of, I do like reading things when there is a who in it. That's one of the problems I have. It's like he gives this as a rigid rule, even though sometimes I feel like it depends. First state what you're talking about and then what you want to say. And I'll give them more example, but usually it's better to just state, first of all, what you're talking about and then what you want to say. First of all, give people idea about what you're talking about and then what are you talking about? And then what you want to say about that thing. If it's a computer, and then blah, blah, blah. Not she only found 2 mistakes, right? She found only 2 mistakes. That's the difference between only found 2 mistakes or found only 2 mistakes. Some differences between where the only would be. The second definitely sounds better. Maintain same tense. So not using like past and future or present tense, especially within a sentence. Between is used when with 2 individuals, while among is when more than 2. So that's between 2, among One is for two, and one is more than two, among. Anyone and any one are not the same thing. Anyone, it's anyone and any one. It kind of sounds very similar, but the difference is a very minor difference. Being should not come after as. So as being should not be together. Can should not replace may. They're not the same thing. Can and may. Due to is more synonymous with attributed to. That's when we should use due to, when we could replace that with attributed to and not in other times. Affect is to influence. That's the differences between affect to effect. Is that affect with an A is to influence, or the way I once heard is action, when there is an action. Side note, some of the advice seemed to be outdated, because some of the things, I haven't included all of them here, but some of the things, some of his rules seem to be a little outdated, and I definitely found or read some other or ways of writing, and I do things that some other ways are perfectly fine. The who after the person is redundant. The similar idea. The person who, you don't have to write who again. That's part of my problem here. That sometimes it's okay. In my opinion, I'm okay with it. Try to avoid saying interesting if what you're talking about is indeed interesting. So that's I always find a little funny, because we do write it. It's an interesting thing, but it's what he advises. His advice is to make it interesting. The thing is that sometimes you cannot make it interesting, or it's very hard to make it interesting. And it's like, it's interesting. I do write interesting sometimes, but he argues against. IEZ suffixes often have more useful verbs. Utilize versus use. That's one of the examples. Utilize, he advised against using IEZ suffixes. So, for example, utilize, he says use instead of utilize. Less and fewer should not be confused. They're not the same. Less and fewer, I think fewer is less potent in a way. Often like can be replaced by as. So he argues against using it like, use as instead. Most and almost are not the same. There is most and there is almost. Again, almost I think is more than most. One should not be used with he or she. Rather use one or oneself again. When you say already he or she, you cannot use one again. You should use one. If you already use one, you say one or oneself again. You cannot use he or she and one interchangeably. Try to avoid using so, x, or so much, and very, and similar words. So, the word of so, something. Try to avoid that. Stating is more precise than saying, so the saying and stating is not the same. Stating is more precise. Try to eliminate which when possible. Again, it's similar to who, which also, which he says eliminate that. In order to avoid pronouns, refer to the audience or use plurals. You either use the audience or call the audience, or use plurals, and then you can avoid using he or she. Use very, the word very, sparingly. You don't use it too much. Again, it's similar to so. Try not to use it. While can be replaced by a semicolon, similar to who, and one way you can replace that is by a semicolon. While should be used when referred to during the time that. That's when we can use while, and we say during the time that. So that's referred to a time, a point in time. Would could sometimes be replaced by a past verb. The word would, sometimes we can replace that by a past verb of the same, not the same, but whatever word we have. Side note, some of the examples giving are unhelpful. Some of them are very obscure and really not very useful because no one uses them. Delete redundant words. It's like similar to omit needless words. Don't explain emotions too much when writing a dialogue. He says, like, give the readers some sense of what to feel, like give them some wiggle room. Leave them something to do. Don't explain too much what exactly whoever you're writing about felt. Don't use pretentious words when simple ones suffice. You need it. There is no point of it. Don't use them. Omit that when it's not needed. Try to eliminate that. When a sentence lacks clarity, it's often easier to break it down to a few sentences. It's better sometimes if it's too long or complicated, it's often easier to just break it down. Shortcuts should only be used after they have been introduced. It's only the only time we should use shortcuts, only after you introduce them. You can say like IRS, don't use IRS, say Internal Revenue Services, and then you can use it again. So that is for the notes. Again, there are some interesting parts. I would advise that if you do want to read this book, buy the actual book, buy the physical book, because listening to it is not a good way of going about. I think generally speaking, all books about reading, or about writing, are probably better actually reading physical books than doing listening. Again, that's a 3 out of 5. Thank you.